Previously on The Coverup.
And George Carlin says, for a conspiracy, it's not necessary that you have people in a room all rubbing their hands together. For a conspiracy to occur, all you have to have is that interests converge.
Through a series of oversight hearings, Senator Paul has exposed dangerous gain-of-function research funded by the NIH, and the lengths government bureaucrats went to cover it up.
Is there a deep state? You're damn right there's a deep state. It's a deep bureaucracy. It's a bureaucracy that goes on generation after generation. And these are people that are unelected and unresponsive to elections.
Today, I will hear from someone who witnessed those same bureaucrats in action firsthand.
I got the news and saw in the news all of these things happening about this virus from China. And it was frightening to everyone because the WHO, the World Health Organization, came out with an infection fatality rate that was massive. It was extremely high of 3.4%. And then after about 5 minutes, you understood that they derived it incorrectly. This is basic stuff that a high school biology student would understand. I became frantic that our government and the policies, particularly in the United States, but also other countries, was so grossly wrong and led by people who were apparently so incompetent that they were killing people with their guidance.
It is much more likely that it is a natural occurrence from an animal to a human.
Social distancing is absolutely critical. And if you can't social distance and you're outside, you must wear a mask.
The NIH and NIAID categorically has not funded gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science.
I'm at Stanford University to talk with Dr. Scott Atlas. As a member of the Trump administration's coronavirus task force, he is in a unique position to explain what actually went on behind the closed doors of the White House. No one else I'm talking to has had such direct interaction with Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx, who led the task force, and Robert Redfield, head of the CDC. If anyone can tell me what was going on behind the scenes, he can.
In March and April and May and June, I was writing and doing an increasing number of interviews and wrote a piece saying, stop the lockdowns, the data is in the Hill in the spring of 2020. And this sort of went viral, as they say, and there were something like 11 million views of this all over the world. It was reprinted, and I was interviewed on national news about this.
Why has your essay struck such a chord? There are 15,000 comments appended to it.
We are creating a catastrophic healthcare situation because this idea of stopping COVID-19 at all costs is now causing people not to seek medical care. There's absolutely no evidence to do things like keep people in their homes, to keep people, to keep K through 12 schools closed. The children have virtually no risk of serious illness, let alone death. And there's no reason to stop businesses from functioning. Because it was contrary to what people like Fauci and Deborah Birx were saying.
Things that can be done, it's certainly not the total solution to the problem, is to to delay, if not cancel, anything that's elective. I mean, any medical or surgical procedures that need to be done on an elective basis should not be done in anticipation of the fact that beds and equipment that you would use even in an elective situation should be used for people who really need it.
And mitigation means to be prepared to do things that would slow down the spread if we had an influx of infections, such as closing schools, social distancing, teleworking, and things like that.
You didn't have to be an expert scientist to understand what was going on and how wrong it was. It was universally denounced. It was, amplified 5 orders of magnitude when I had the audacity to try to help the country under a president that people disapproved of.
The president's new medical advisor, Dr. Scott Atlas, whose public stance on the pandemic echoes Trump's unscientific claims.
And at that point, my employer, people who really exposed themselves as being completely ignorant and politicized, the Stanford University Medical School people, wrote a letter which was some kind of an ad hominem attack with no data whatsoever, no facts whatsoever, and they distributed and they aggressively internally tried to get people to condemn me. They wrote it in the op-ed pages of major newspapers, etc., and ultimately, when the Stanford faculty issued a formal censure of me, these are university professors and leaders of universities who set the example for our children that character assassination, that these reckless statements and vilification, demonization are the way to have the discussion rather than the universities and the media being the free exchange of ideas. I had FBI involved in both Washington, D.C., and when I came home, I had 24/7 security police in my driveway for months in Palo Alto. And it was a very sad example of a combination of ignorance, arrogance, and politics. The pandemic didn't create anything, in my view. The pandemic exposed people for who they are. So I do believe it was political in the beginning. Of course, it couldn't have been political in the end because it was all over Western civilization, pretty much. But it still retained some political divide. My position was never political. I was not a political, I didn't have a political position. And the President of the United States calls you up and says, we need you to help. The answer is yes.
The president continues to dismiss the seriousness of this killer and has just added a new official to his coronavirus task force who promises to be a faithful skipper on the SS Nothing to See Here folks that the president promised would only be taking us on a 3-hour tour.
By the way, the gentleman, you know everybody, you know Russell, you know, but this is Scott Atlas, you know that, right? He's working with us and will be working with us on the coronavirus. And he has many great ideas, and he thinks what we've done is really good, and now we'll take it to a new level.
The Washington Post, one of the president's new scientific advisors, is promoting the concept of herd immunity, letting COVID-19 run pretty much unchecked.
Dr. Atlas, okay, a guy with no pandemic experience. He literally would know more if he stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
Dr. Atlas clearly wouldn't know science if it kicked him in the Atlas.
I wasn't trying to get a second job. I wasn't trying to protect my job. I didn't care. I had no secondary motivation except people were dying and the president was completely being advised completely incorrectly, and somebody had to try to help.
What I want to know is, how did these people get into power in the first place? Throughout the pandemic, we were told these were the top doctors, the top scientists in America. If it turns out they were not competent to do the job, why were they there? Who hired them?
First, you have to realize Fauci, Birx, these people were career bureaucrats. They were not doctors. It's sort of a joke to see pictures of them with a white coat on. I mean, these people, Fauci was in his bureaucratic position for 38 years.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1984.
It's not that they survived different administrations because they were so good at science or critical thinking. They survived because they're very politically astute.
You've been at the NIH a pretty long time, and it seems to me that during your tenure, our ability to control infectious diseases hasn't improved, but in fact worsened. And don't you think it's time that you step down and let someone else who has a more effective message?
Actually, no.
So that was sort of a very political group because they were bureaucrats. That's what they were. They proved it by their gross lack of understanding of what was going on.
That was the report that said there would be 500,000 deaths in the UK and 2.2 million deaths in the United States. They've adjusted that number in the UK to 20,000. So 500,000 to 20,000. We're looking into this in great detail to understand that adjustment.
They never had a single scientific paper that they brought into any of the meetings. None, zero. And I had 24, and I would bring in all the newest data to every task force meeting that I attended. There never was a refutation of what I said on the basis of data. The only refutation was anger by Deborah Birx.
From Deborah Birx to Anthony Fauci and Robert Redfield, I'm more convinced than ever the dangers of Dr. Atlas's views on this pandemic.
And claiming I was, quote, an outlier.
Well, most are working together. I think you know what the outlier is.
That's not exactly a scientific criticism.
So let's explain to people who you were before you went to the Trump White House and what you did at the Trump White House, starting with your medical experience.
Sure. So I am an MD. I went to University of Chicago Medical School and did training and at Northwestern, where I was chief resident. Went to University of Pennsylvania and spent about half of a medical scientist career at the hospitals of the University of Pennsylvania, and then came to Stanford for 13 years as professor-in-chief of a large division, neuroradiology, in the Stanford School of Medicine. I have written as a medical scientist that did clinical work, teaching other doctors, and research. I had published over 100 peer-reviewed papers in medical journals. I have given over 600 visiting professor lectures at basically every top medical school in the country. This was all before COVID. And in 2012, so about a decade before, I took a full-time position as an endowed position at Hoover Institution in healthcare policy and quit the medical school because I don't dabble in things. And so I've been working on healthcare policy for, a decade.
For simply presenting data, the media went after Scott hard. So he was surprised when a phone call from the White House asked him to advise the president. Someone, at least, was listening. But others, especially members of the COVID task force, were not happy about what he had to say.
I got there July 31st, and I said, okay, it was clear. I didn't even want to be on the task force because I knew that they wouldn't accept anything I said. But it was this horrendous hit piece after hit piece in the news, and I thought, okay, I need to get good people in here to answer the president's questions. Besides me. It can't be just me against the world. And so I arranged 4 other medical scientists to come in August of 2020. And they were Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford, Cody Meisner of Tufts, and Joe Ladapo of UCLA. This was in August of 2020. We all came in to answer the president's questions. I arranged the meeting, and the day within 12 hours before the meeting, Birx tried to sabotage the meeting by saying, even though we arranged it so that she could come, she said, I'm not going to go to the meeting. It's not good for her.
From Deborah Birx to Anthony Fauci and Robert Redfield, I can't be part of this with these people who believe in herd immunity. They are a fringe group without grounding in epidemics, public health, or on-the-ground common sense experience. I am happy to go out of town or whatever gives the White House cover for Wednesday.
So I was called in by Jared Kushner, and he said, the meeting's off. And I went ballistic, sort of, because, again, people were dying. And I said, well, no, I went crazy. And then he said, okay, you have 5 minutes. It's a meet and greet, 5 minutes. So, okay, I said okay, because it's better than zero. And I talked with all these medical experts, the 5 of us, before the meeting in my office, and I said, we're going to meet with the president. Don't go off and start talking about stuff. We have 5 minutes. So just answer his questions and answer everything truthfully. That was what I said. Don't start giving an exposition. That's not the purpose of it. Just answer his questions. And we got in there, and President Trump turned to me and said, okay, Scott, take it away. I introduced everybody, and we went. And he asked questions of each one of us, very intelligent questions, the right questions about all the topics for the next 45 minutes to an hour. And I kept being handed a paper from people behind me. End at 5 minutes. And I'm not going to interrupt the president, number one, obviously. And number two, it was important. So I'll end the meeting when he ends the meeting. I didn't care what they said. And so it went on for almost an hour. And he even filmed a video of me discussing what was happening here. That video, of course, has never been released.
That is such a bizarre story because it really does. Politics alone don't quite explain to me why that happened. I have this theory that Fauci and Birx, and you make this very clear, that they're walking lockstep. What one says, the other says, and reiterates each other at every turn. Early on, before you got to the White House, Trump had kind of turned Fauci into his Frankenstein's monster because he platformed him, right? He's doing these daily briefings, and Fauci became our America's scientist/doctor telling us what to do. He's such a media hound that he sort of embraced that.
I'd like him to go back to the State Department, or as they call it, the Deep State Department. You don't mind? I'd like to have him go back and do his job. So does anybody have any question? Please.
So is it possible that the political operatives in the White House were afraid that Fauci would quit and denounce them? Was that his power?
Well, I think they were absolutely afraid, complete cowards about Fauci and Birx. And, you know, there were reputations about some of these people being very brittle, and you know, I saw a tremendous amount of insecurity in both of them at these meetings because they weren't used to somebody coming in and actually knowing the information and thinking critically about it. But it was, you know, it came out later after I left, so say January, February 2021, Birx said that she had a pact with Fauci and Redfield that if any of them were fired by Trump, they would all resign. That doesn't sound like people who are interested in helping the country. That sounds like people who are interested in their own position.
I don't think Fauci's an idiot. I think he's a very crafty political operative. But I also think he's got this hubris. He thinks he can redesign civil society in this very science-y kind of way, and it's the dangers that Hayek talked about when we tried to sort of apply simple hard sciences to the nature of human action. They are central planners in the worst sense. They think they can tweak this and tweak that.
Absolutely.
And nudge behavior and create a better society that way.
I mean, this is absolutely a critical problem that needs to be first realized by the American public, and then policies must be put in place to minimize the power of those people, because there is an absolute arrogance. Obviously, the most famous, blatant example of the arrogance is when Fauci claimed that criticizing him is criticizing science itself.
They're really criticizing science because I represent science.
I think we're all raised to respect authority, respect credentials. I think that's how most of us have been raised. And I personally believe that a lot of people, most people, are intimidated by people who are PhDs or MDs. About the science field is intimidating to what I'll call laymen. And so I saw this, Birx and Fauci, they walk around with an entourage in the White House, and when they speak, okay, everybody listens. And I heard many, many times after I got into the task force meetings, people that were non-scientists in those rooms were coming up to me saying, thank you for saying that. I knew that what they were saying was wrong, but who am I to say I'm not a scientist? You know, I don't have the same background as a lot of these people. I came from a very poor family. My grandparents were not, they were immigrants. I was the first generation to go to college in my family. I don't come from an elitist background because there's an elitism of this that's part of this mix that leads to the arrogance. And, I've been called many times an outlier, and I'm proud to be an outlier because the inliers are completely wrong.
So you used the word stupidity, and the word zombie popped into my head because it was so unified, and they're all sort of mindlessly shuffling in the same direction, which couldn't be more anti-scientific process. The give and take and the iterative debates that real scientists should have to discover things that they don't fully understand. And that happened long before there was any association with Trump.
Early on, Trump said, open up, we can't shut down.
Ultimately, the goal is to ease the guidelines and open things up to very large sections of our country as we near the end of our historic battle with the invisible enemy. I said earlier today that I hope we can do this by Easter.
And this was met with a huge backlash.
The governors of New York and California have both closed down their states, and there is nothing Donald Trump can do about that. So Donald Trump cannot reopen anything. Donald Trump is not in charge here. The governors are in charge, and that is good news.
At the president's press conference today, he said, our country wasn't built to be shut down. He said normal life will return soon. He seems to be suggesting that these social distancing measures that we're taking should be relieved sometime soon. Just have to ask how that landed with you.
That landed pretty poorly. I cannot emphasize enough how important social distancing is right now.
Coronavirus cases crossed 42,000. We've now become the country with the second highest recorded active cases, headed, it seems, unfortunately, towards number one. And at this moment, President Trump is very obviously indecisive and losing his nerve. And millions of lives are on the line because of it.
And I have to think some of that was political because the U.S. economy and other parts of the United States were doing quite well, and it was an election year. And I think from what I saw in Washington, how vicious, how unconscionably unethical people are, I actually believe that opposition politicians would rather have people die than lose power.
I wonder, these two bureaucrats with so much power, who are they working for?
Birx was appointed February 29th, 2020 to lead the task force.
She has served in the uniform of the United States. She has served in multiple administrations, and she's going to be our right arm.
She was actually a fellow in my program as a trainee, and we knew she was a star then. And now what has happened over the years, she's become a superstar.
And the whole time I was there, which was from July 31st, 2020 until mid-November 2020, I couldn't find anyone who admitted that they actually brought Birx in.
We now know that Deborah Birx was appointed to the task force by Matthew Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor. Birx knew Pottinger through his wife, but they had never worked together. Like Pottinger, her background was in national security, having cut her teeth doing AIDS research for the military. So how does someone with no experience in epidemiology or public health policy get put in charge of the entire federal response to COVID? Pottinger knew that she would be a reliable spokesperson, not for public health, but for the military-industrial apparatus that put her in charge.
Pence was the titular head of the task force. Pence would say, yes, Scott, I agree, but then he would go and say what Birx said. Birx was writing all the guidance. I had no input on the guidance to the states. She wrote all of it, and all of her guidance kept insisting that everything has to be test, test, test.
So we've been expanding testing at a logarithmic rate over the last 4 weeks. We've gone from about 20,000 a day to 120,000 a day.
People are very concerned about the testing.
That's an excellent question.
Quarantine, lockdown, lockdown, lockdown.
Please stay home. Please follow the guidelines, 6 feet distance, and very important to have your mask with you in case that 6 feet different distance cannot be maintained.
Which is, of course, insane and completely contrary to the data. That's what the parallel message was. But the political side kept saying, Scott, shut up. Their quote was repeatedly, don't rock the boat, there's an election coming up.
Birx's pandemic guidance wasn't motivated by scientific data or time-tested public health measures, but by the irrational fear of what she referred to as the silent spread.
A sense that there's early, asymptomatic, silent spread.
The idea that this virus was far more transmissible and dangerous because it could be spread by asymptomatic individuals without detection. However, this actually might make the virus less dangerous, as a higher number of mild or asymptomatic cases lowers the overall fatality rate. With no data or medical expertise to back up her policies, she leaned into the one weapon she had to prevent anyone from questioning her authority: fear. In response to a major public health emergency, it seems deeply strange to me that the National Security Council had such pull, and then gave so much authority to a career Department of Defense bureaucrat like Birx. It's starting to look more and more like the response to COVID was less about public health and more about military-style controls on the population.
There was a high opinion in the public of Fauci and Birx at the time. Partly because they disagreed with Trump.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that?
I mean, which was sort of strange logic to keep them in there. But, I just think that you should never elect people who care more about winning power than about people dying, than about our children being destroyed. I mean, this shouldn't even need to be said. It's almost bizarre that it has to be said. But this is what I was up against there. I said the boat is effing capsized. People are dying. I'm not going to shut up. And I didn't.
I'm trying to piece together some of the motives behind all of this. Is it purely arrogance, a self-righteous conviction that the experts know best how to organize society? Or are there other factors at play, maybe financial factors?
There are many forms of corruption that were impactful during the management of the pandemic. I first want to say it's too simple to say that it's financial alone. I think there is financial corruption. There is no question that there's financial corruption. Not only is there corruption of money from big pharma, if you will, going to a lot of people, both doctors and scientists and researchers. I think people would be shocked to understand that individual people in the CDC, in the NIH, in the FDA share royalties of drugs they approve. This is massive conflict of interest. And of course, conflict of interest doesn't mean that the people are intentionally doing things wrong, but it's a conflict of interest. They cannot be in the situation of being presumed objective when there is such a conflict of interest. And Anthony Fauci is one of those people who personally received royalties from these companies. I think there's massive pharma corruption, but you're talking about something that's even more nefarious and more harmful, which is the centralization of funding from the NIH. Every university scientist in the country, to get promoted from assistant to associate or associate to full professor, every single academic scientist needs NIH grants. You cannot get promoted without NIH grants. In infectious disease, Fauci is the sign-off on NIH funding, and it's a small, what I call a cartel of people that controls American science. They don't just control the funding. They control what topics are funded. It's not just the individual granting of money. And so you have more than 15 university medical centers in the United States, each of which gets over $500 million every year, each one from the NIH alone. This is a massive problem because all the academic scientists need the NIH, so they're not going to speak out or they would be risking their careers. All the university medical centers depend on this massive inflow of money from the NIH. They don't want to cut that off. You really do have a cartel that is this overly centralized governing body on all of science. This has to stop. This has to be decentralized. In addition, Francis Collins was the head of the NIH during this scandal, under Fauci's guidance, funded dangerous gain-of-function research in Wuhan, in the Wuhan lab. That's documented by Government Accountability Reports, GAO. $2 million of funding from the NIH directly and indirectly to the Wuhan lab in China during years where that research was banned in the United States. They did it circumventing the rules. Why was it banned? Because it was too dangerous. So we have this kind of cover-up motivation that isn't really financial. It's sort of separate. It's covering up malfeasance, perhaps criminal malfeasance. I don't know. That'll be up to Senator Paul and others to determine. Masks were known in spring of 2020 to be ineffective at either protecting the wearer or stopping the spread to other people in these viral respiratory infections. That was published where? By the CDC. It was a compilation of all the studies, all the randomized controlled trials, and it was very clear. That was May 2020. Everybody knew it. Second point is the data objectively in the places wearing masks, not just mask mandates, but actually wearing masks. We're in schools, for instance, where masks were enforced, and there was no evidence at all of a decrease in the spread of the infection or protection of the wearer by these masks. And of course, it makes sense because I'm talking about surgical masks here. I'm not talking about a scarf from an NFL team that's wrapped around your face. I'm talking about a surgical mask. And the problem was explaining that to people. I mean, the reality is, okay, people said, but doctors wear masks. Okay, so, well, I've done hundreds of medical procedures, hundreds more, by the way, than anyone on the task force. They weren't doctors, really, in any sense, true sense of the word. So I did hundreds of medical procedures wearing a surgical mask. Why? Because masks stop you, the doctor, from sneezing or spitting or coughing into a sterile incision, or they prevent a spurt of blood from going into your face. And so this is just a big blockage of splashes, basically. The size of the virus is smaller than the holes in a surgical mask. We don't have to be a genius to figure out the surgical masks don't work. And so I tweeted early on when I was in the White House in August, the data from the CDC and the World Health Organization and the FDA and the actual data in the cities wearing masks, that masks don't work. And that tweet was not only pulled down, I was blocked from using Twitter. And at this time you have to realize I'm a advisor to the president on the pandemic. I mean, you would think that the American people would want to hear what the advisor to the president was saying during an emergency. I think that was the most shocking example of censorship that I saw. I remember a good friend of mine said, Scott, don't write that. And I said, why? He said, because it will create a massive frenzy. If you say in your visible position, masks don't work, because people are desperate to feel they have some way to control this, to protect themselves. And you're going to take that away. If you say that they don't work and you show that it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, he said, that they don't work. They need this as a security. So, okay, I understand that, but I also think in an ethical society, we need truth. I mean, I can't live in a society that pretends scientific data doesn't exist. When you look at the trust, we need to trust science. We need to trust leadership institutions in a diverse society. We have a very large country. People don't have the time to go and look at the original data and critique the study designs of all these papers. We need to trust experts. We have lost the trust in the expert class. And this is a severe problem in our country.
Maybe so much collateral damage is the only way to explain the fact that now that the American public doesn't agree with them on masking. I mean, I can just look at how many people are wearing a mask on a plane as I flew out here, but Fauci still insists it's the right thing to do, and it can't be politics anymore. Now it has to be defending my legacy, because if I can't defend my legacy of lockdowns and school closures and all of this collateral damage, then I'm responsible for what I've done.
I think you're exactly right. There is to admit you're wrong requires integrity. These people have no integrity. It's necessary, but also it's important to restore trust. The first step in getting someone to trust you is to show that you know when you were wrong and you're willing to admit it. But they have no integrity. They will never, never admit they were wrong. It's a self-preservation thing. Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx, who was the head of the White House task force, who gave all the written evidence, all the written guidelines from the federal branch to the states. Deborah Birx personally wrote all the guidelines. And they got what they wanted, by the way. They wanted the lockdowns and the school closures, and they got them. So any assessment of the quality of the response under the Trump administration is directly assessing what Fauci and Birx guided. If you think that Trump did poorly, then you're saying Fauci and Birx guidance was wrong and bad. If you're saying Fauci and Birx were good in what they said, then you're saying Trump administration policy was good. I had no authority. Nobody listened to me except for Governor DeSantis, who I've been advising since spring of 2020. He opened. Okay, Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota, she opened. They understood the data and common sense. But the legacy of Fauci and Birx and Redfield is they presided over the worst fiasco in public health history. They destroyed, hopefully not irreparably, a younger generation, creating hysteria, massive psychological harms on teenagers and college students, suicidal ideation, cigarettes being put out on their skin, self-harm, a massive spike in anxiety and depression. These are all from the lockdown, not the virus. And an obesity crisis where more than half of college-age Americans had an average weight gain during 2020 of 28 pounds. That's an obesity crisis. They did that. They caused that. And the third massive problem with their legacy, they destroyed trust in public health and science. And I'm not sure how easy that will be to recover from. What we allowed ourselves to do as a country, and eventually, really, the responsibility lies with the individual, because the good reforms will not come from the top. They will not come from the top down. We as individuals need to get some courage here and speak up and do the right thing, because I guarantee you the lockdowns could have been stopped in New York City if 1 million New Yorkers went to Central Park and said no, because it makes no sense. It's counter to all the pandemic management data. Okay, but nobody did that. The tough New Yorkers hid. They were afraid. And I know they were brainwashed, they had propaganda, they were afraid, and all that's rational, but that continued for months and then years, that fear. We still see people in Palo Alto, where I live, wearing masks outside. I see Stanford University students that are supposedly so smart wearing masks on their skateboards outside. These are the dumbest people in the world, in my view. And we have elected many of them to lead us. Governor Newsom, Governor Whitmer of Michigan. These are people who, they're non-thinking people. Because the fact is that the Florida response, they did better than California. Better, period, end of discussion. So we don't just have people who are incompetent in charge. Now we have people who are trying to rewrite history or overtly lie to the American people. I remember someone, I think it was Redfield, referred to someone as the ambassador, and I decided X. I didn't know what he was talking about. And then it turned out he was talking about Burks. These people love their titles. This is a pathologic group of people. I don't have respect for people on the basis of their titles. What I say is the era of assuming that people are correct based upon their title must be over. This is the emperor's new clothes times 1,000 here. They're afraid to have any debate or anything like this. And so I was raised to question authority and have a healthy degree of skepticism, my father used to tell me, about what's said. And I think that's a very sort of important part of checking authority. You must think. You don't just do what they say. In the 2022 midterm elections, I think there were 9 governors that ran for re-election, including the mayor of DC, who were the most stringent lockdowners, who destroyed the children of the people in the voting population, who did the worst on the quantified assessment of how the pandemic was managed. And 8 of the 9 were re-elected in November 2022. And we have to exercise the power in a democracy where people vote. You have to stand up. I said rise up. Rise up means speak up, vote, get these dangerous people out of their positions of power. We need people who understand they work for us. We don't work for them. They're elected. They're employees. That's what the President of the United States is and everybody else in our government. They are employees of the people. But we need to realize that. We need to wake up and use that power.
Dr. Atlas's experience inside the White House leaves me wondering how we ended up with so many unqualified bureaucrats dictating the nation's public health policy. I suspect the answer may lie in the surge in funding that came after 9/11 and the new collaboration between the NIH and the Defense Department. It's hard to get to the truth because of the extreme secrecy among security agencies, but I want to know who else was involved. Beyond the DoD, what role did Homeland Security, or even the CIA, FBI, and NSA play in imposing lockdowns and controlling the narrative of the pandemic? To see what I can find out, I'm headed to the Garden State to talk to Dr. Richard Ebright, a molecular biologist at Rutgers University and one of Fauci and Birx's fiercest critics. Next time on The Coverup.